In this analysis, we're going to take a closer look at a particular psychological framework that's been presented in an online source. This model, which is sometimes referred to as a map of the mind, puts forward a kind of system for understanding human behavior. Our goal here is simply to explore its principles and its internal logic, really just from an observational point of view.
Now, this assertion really gets to the heart of the source material's premise. It suggests that what might look like complex, even unpredictable behavior is actually governed by an underlying, predictable system. This idea is the bedrock for the entire framework we'll be examining today.
So here's the path we'll be taking. We'll start with the foundational idea of internal conflict, then move into the dynamics of attraction and subconscious influences, and we'll finish up with the model's ultimate focus, which is self-mastery.
Let's begin with the first component of the framework. This piece centers on a proposed internal tension. It introduces this idea of a psychological duality and, more importantly, how that duality is said to show up in observable behavior.
At the core of this model is a proposition the source calls the rule of the conflict. It theorizes that there's this fundamental tension, a push and pull between our innate desires and the social norms we've internalized. This conflict is described as a kind of constant negotiation happening inside a person. So, according to this model, this internal tug-of-war doesn't just stay inside. It's used to explain behaviors that might otherwise seem inconsistent. For instance, the act of moving towards someone, which is then followed by an act of withdrawal, isn't seen as random. It's interpreted as a direct, external sign of this unresolved internal dynamic.
Building on that idea, the framework introduces another key concept: psychological testing. Now, it's careful to define this not as some conscious strategy, but as a subconscious, almost instinctive mechanism. The stated purpose of these behaviors is to gauge a potential partner's emotional stability, their resilience, all in service of a deeper need for safety.
So, if we accept the premise for a moment that our outward behavior really does mirror our inner world, it brings up an interesting question. What might a recurring pattern of these so-called tests suggest about an individual's fundamental underlying search for security?
All right, the next section of the model looks at the interplay between attraction, fear, and a very specific definition of strength. It explores how these different elements are said to govern the emotional distance between people. Now, within this framework, it's really important to understand how strength is defined. It's not physical. It's presented as a psychological quality. It's characterized by emotional self-regulation, a sense of presence, and confidence, especially when things get chaotic. And this quality is positioned as a primary driver of attraction.
The model then lays out what it describes as a paradoxical cycle. It suggests that intense feelings of emotional closeness can actually trigger old, latent fears of loss, fears of rejection, maybe rooted in past experiences. And in response to that, an individual might instinctively create distance as a form of self-protection, a defense against being hurt.
This proposed dynamic, where getting closer can actually activate fear, it raises a question. What does this model imply about the deep connection between emotional intimacy and our sense of vulnerability? From here, the framework goes a layer deeper. It starts to delve into subconscious communication and the impact of our early life experiences, suggesting that these things operate almost like a hidden script for our adult lives. The source material proposes a kind of hierarchy of communication. Spoken words are framed as a reflection of social conditioning, what we feel we should say to be acceptable. In contrast, nonverbal cues, what it calls observed signals, are presented as the more authentic language, the one that reveals a deeper, unfiltered truth from the subconscious. This part really illustrates the model's psychodynamic perspective. It posits that our formative relationships, especially with parents, create a kind of map that goes on to dictate our adult relational patterns. Unresolved pain from that time is said to show up again and again in who we're attracted to, attracting people who resonate with those old dynamics. Certain behaviors are then seen as protective strategies that were learned way back in childhood.
And this perspective naturally leads to a pretty critical question. If our actions are so heavily guided by subconscious patterns and past experiences, what role does this framework leave for our conscious agency, for deliberate choice, and for just straightforward communication in the here and now?
And that brings us to the final section of the framework, which is where things become their most introspective. Here, the analysis pivots, and the focus shifts away from understanding someone else and turns toward understanding oneself.
The framework takes a really significant turn at this point. After all this extensive analysis of another person's supposed psychology, it concludes that the real objective isn't external control at all. It's internal mastery.
The focus shifts entirely to one's own emotional reactions to the behaviors that were just described.
This concluding statement really reframes the entire map that came before it. The complex system that was laid out is ultimately presented as a kind of mirror, something that reflects the observer's own internal state. The external analysis becomes a tool for an internal diagnosis.
And this leaves us with a final reflective question. Any model, any map designed to explain the inner world of another person is, by its very nature, the product of a particular point of view. So this invites us to ask, what does the construction of such a map ultimately reveal, not just about the territory it claims to describe, but about the mapmaker themselves?